Okay, so here we are for the review for the final examination, and I'm going to be discussing the study questions for the final in just a moment. But let me say one other thing about Goldsmith, Oliver Goldsmith, and his poem, The Deserted Village. He also notes that while some people who have been driven out of their villages and off of their farmlands as a result of these enclosure acts, which were basically land grabs by wealthy and powerful people, that others have been driven abroad. And so he talks about how people have had to go, for example, to America, whether they wanted to or not. After all, people had to find some way of trying to stay alive. And so he felt that what has happened as a consequence is a decimation of the ordinary peoples of England. So, okay. Are you ready for the review for the final examination now? All right. Remember now what I said way back when at the beginning of the course. For the final examination, you can use your textbook, and that includes a copy of the text of Hamlet. But I ask that you not use any additional books or additional materials. I'm also going to ask you to use a blue book to write the exam in. And, if you come dashing in, harried because you've just been trying to avoid having an accident and you weren't able to get a blue book, don't worry. I mean, I'm not going to kick you out. But I much prefer that you write your examination in a blue book. People often ask me, well, can I bring a dictionary? If you want to bring a dictionary, it's fine to bring a dictionary. But once again, no other additional notes or materials. Nor am I going to have you use your class notes here. Now, people always say, well, what about notes that I write in the text? It's your text. If you want to write in your textbook, write in your textbook. I think I mentioned one time earlier on in the course, I always write with a pen in my hand because I'm always taking notes on what I'm reading. It's a way of reading. It's a way of very actively reading and responding to what you're reading. And it also imprints things in your memory that are not imprinted in the same way if you don't take notes. Okay, any questions just about what I've said up to this point about the final exam? Okay, everybody knows that you're going to have to write on the Shakespeare project, which we talked about for some hours earlier on in the course when we were studying Hamlet. So you know that that's going to be obligatory, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes when we get to that question. And you know also that the questions on the final examination are going to be taken word for word without any change whatsoever from the questions that I'm giving you now in the review. Okay? Now, I'm not going to ask you to answer all 22 questions. So I'll be giving you a smaller number. What is the exact number? What's the exact makeup of the exam? Well, I'll know that when I make up the exam. So when you come to write the exam, you will see the exam laid out, with the questions, recognizing, of course, you're going to have to write on Hamlet, and just prepare for writing on the other questions, okay, as well as Hamlet, of course. Okay, any questions about that? All right, well, let's go to the PowerPoint. Okay, number one, discuss some specific ways in which pagan and Christian elements are interwoven in Beowulf. And notice I've put quotes around the word pagan. This takes us all the way back to the beginning of the course, doesn't it? Some specific ways in which so-called pagan and Christian elements are interwoven in Beowulf. We spent a good deal of time talking about that, about how there are certain cultural elements which are still there in Beowulf and in poems contemporary with Beowulf, or more or less contemporary with Beowulf, certainly from the same period as Beowulf, that are carries over from an earlier time before the coming of Christianity to England. We also talked about how the conversion of England to Christianity was a very lengthy and in many ways a very uneven process. So that what happened in one part of England was not necessarily happening or happening at the same time or at the same rate of speed in another part of England. And that's something to keep in mind here, because that's what allows for the kind of unevenness that we find in Beowulf, for example, where sometimes you will have very, very direct Christian references, and then in other places you will have what seems to be a reference to some kind of pre-Christian or at least non-Christian religious attitude, belief, or narrative. Think about some of the characters in Beowulf. You know, we have the figure of Grendel. You know, what does Grendel signify? What about the Grendel coming from the kin of Cain? And then when we look at the kin of Cain, look who the kin of Cain are. They're not human beings. We would expect to find human beings, right? But we also find all of these other very, very bizarre creatures, including elves, and giants, and whatnot, all of whom presumably bear, in some sense or another, the mark of Cain. Well, okay, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, where you have these blendings and mixings of these different kinds of elements. Because we have a culture which is in transition. That's a phrase that I used over and over and over again when we were talking about Beowulf and the works contemporary with Beowulf. We have a culture in transition. Okay? Any questions about this? Yeah, question. Really? Oh. Okay, okay, yeah. Okay, well, do you have a button to press there? No, okay. Okay. The question, by the way, for those of you who may wonder what it was could I talk louder? This is obviously not going to be an issue for those people who are watching this on television, but for those of you who are here in this room, the problem, of course, is that the acoustics are really awful in this room, but should be good enough, you know, to be picked up by this microphone here. But I know that's not what you're asking for right now. So also, there are some couple of places up here closer if you want to move up. Can others hear me okay? In the back? Okay. Okay, no, don't be embarrassed. That's all right. That's all right. Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, there are a couple of seats right up here, and there's another one over here, and so forth, if you want to move up. Yeah, question?
Would the comitatus practice and is that considered, since you're saying is it something that would change after Christianity, and that's something that didn't change after Christianity, but I don't know if it's really considered a pagan. So is that something that you're looking for, or is that not as pagan as you're indicating? Well,
that's not exactly what I had in mind, but it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question because it is a practice that began, as we know from Tacitus, the Roman historian Tacitus. It's a practice which began long, long before the coming of Christianity to the peoples of the north. But it's not directly Christian, though or pagan, though it could certainly be Christianized, as in the Dream of the Rood, where that whole comitatus relationship is transformed into the relationship between Christ and the cross. But that's an interesting question. What I had in mind were more, the mixing up of things like the story of Cain and the story of all of these creatures, which would come out of an earlier mythology, an earlier northern mythology. Or things like, even the figures of Grendel, Grendel's mother, the dragon, and so forth, coming from very, very distant, very, very early northern mythology. And to what extent now have these been brought into a Christian context? And have they been altered by being brought into a Christian context? And if so, how have they been altered? Those are some interesting questions. We raised the question of weird or fate. Remember weird? W-Y-R-D, or fate. Well, if you really take seriously the idea of fate, then what room is there for some kind of human moral choice or even human moral freedom, right? So notice that the whole business of weird the mighty, weird conquers all, and so forth, certainly appears to come out of an earlier worldview than that of Christianity, okay, which does emphasize elements of moral choice, moral freedom, moral choice, and therefore moral responsibility. Okay, I mean, if you're not free, then how can you be held liable or responsible for your actions? If you were compelled to do whatever you do, how could you be held morally responsible? Okay, so these are important and interesting questions. What I want you to do here, as I am going to ask you to do with other questions, is to think of very specific things and be able to point to very specific things in the works. What specifically in Beowulf makes you think whatever it is that you think? Okay? Point me to an episode. Point me to some kind of passage. That's one of the reasons why I say you can use your books. You can use your books. And use your books in preparing for these questions. Okay, so let me go to the next question. Question 2. Discuss the question of overall unity in Beowulf. And once again, and I'm going to say this over and over again, be sure to make specific references to the text. Okay? The question of overall unity in Beowulf. Well, it generally takes this kind of form. The question takes this kind of form. You look at Beowulf, and yes, everything relates to Beowulf in one way or another. So it has that kind of unity. But then when you actually look at the development of the narrative, you see that the narrative is constantly straying into various sorts of byways, what some people have thought to be digressions, and so on. The work as a whole tends to fall into two parts, where you have Beowulf in his youth, you have Beowulf in his old age. Well, what kind of connections are there? What kind of overall unity do you find in the poem? And this is something that we talked about at considerable length when we were talking about the narrative construction of Beowulf. And in particular, you may recall, if you go back to whatever notes you have, you may recall that I talked about this in terms of the theories developed by J.R.R. Tolkien. You know, we know Tolkien, of course, from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but also Tolkien was a scholar and critic of medieval literature, especially the medieval literature of the North, of Old English or Anglo-Saxon, of Old Norse, Old Icelandic, the saga literature. And he knew this stuff inside and out, probably better than anybody of his generation, maybe better than anybody, period. But in any event, he developed certain theories about Beowulf in which he said that the kind of unity we find in Beowulf is not that we have a straightforward narrative in which everything is causally connected to everything else. But what we have is an overall symbolic structure in which we have the balancing of oppositions, especially symbolic oppositions. The heroic figure in youth and in age. The world in light and the world in dark. The first part of the poem celebrating the heroic qualities of the youthful Beowulf with his great successes in his fights against incredible odds, versus the latter part of Beowulf in which the tone turns elegiac. Remember? Elegiac? Like an elegy. What is an elegy? We've just been talking about an elegy, haven't we? In the case of Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, an elegy is a poem about death or about somebody who has died, or a meditation on death or dying. So that's much of what we find in the latter part of Beowulf, right? Is this elegiac tone. Everything seems to be coming to an end. We have again and again and again either reminders of people who have died in the past, such as Beowulf's uncle Hygelac, or we have things like the Lay of the Last Survivor of his people, which is parallel to the Old English poem The Wanderer. Or, of course, we have Beowulf now anticipating his own death, because he realizes that he no longer has the kind of strength that he did when he was a young man. Now he cannot go forth to fight this monster without a weapon, as he did earlier in the poem, but he's going to have to go forth fully armed and with a stout weapon in his hand. And so, according to Tolkien then, what we have is this balancing in a kind of tension of these opposing forces or qualities or symbolic patterns. And that's something to be thinking about. Now, what kinds of specific things, if you were to say what I basically just said now, what kinds of specific things would you point to in Beowulf? You know, what episodes would you point to? What passages would you point to? Okay? And that's your task. Okay, number 3. Something that we also spent a fair amount of time talking about, to describe the functions of gift-giving in Beowulf. And by the way, I should point out that while these first 3 questions are all focused on Beowulf, we did read some other Old English literature, didn't we? We read The Dream of the Rood, we read The Wanderer, we read Cædmon's story and Cædmon's hymn here. And you can make references to those in your discussion of Beowulf if you wish. So that here, notice, Beowulf is not the only poem in which we find an example of gift-giving. So we find a corroboration of that being a cultural function with cultural values outside of the poem Beowulf as well. So, I want your focus, however, to be on Beowulf, but it is possible for you to make allusions to other works around it to support some of your contentions. Now, gift giving. We have gift giving all the way through, don't we? All the way through. The most obvious places are when the Lord is described as a gift giver or as a ring giver. And, for example, Hrothgar, after Beowulf has done in Grendel, and then after he does in Grendel's mother, what does he do? He gives great gifts to Beowulf. And this is what a lord is supposed to do, we are reminded again and again in the poem. That is what establishes the comitatus. Going back to your question about the comitatus, that is what establishes the comitatus, the gift giving, the gift sharing, really, because the function of receiving a gift is just as important as the function of giving the gift in the first place. Okay? Remember something else which is associated with that I said at the time when we were discussing this problem, that when you're talking about wealth in this culture, wealth is only valuable to the extent to which it is shared. If I just grab what I can and hold on to wealth, it is useless. Okay? Look at the hoard of the dragon. Look at the treasure that's going to be buried by the last survivor of his people. It's totally useless. Wealth is only worth something when it is shared with others. Now notice that's very different from a kind of modern American conception of the accumulation of wealth. But we're entering into a different kind of culture here with a different set of values. So, why is it valuable when it's shared? Once again, because not only in the giving of wealth, but in the receiving of wealth, a bond of loyalty is formed between gift giver and gift recipient. So, that constitutes the comitatus, right at the beginning of Beowulf. I mean, the first few lines of Beowulf. We learn that a wise leader is going to give out gifts early. Why? Because almost inevitably some problems are going to arise later on when the leader is going to have to call upon the loyalty of others. This is how that loyalty can be forged. And remember, in this kind of a culture also, it was important to be able to establish bonds of loyalty with as many friendly people as you could. You only had so many blood kin whom you could count on, and sometimes you couldn't count on your blood kin. Remember, Unferth is described as someone who has killed his brothers. You know, there may be some times when people other than your own blood kin are more reliable than your own blood kin. So through marriage, that was one way of extending the bonds of relations. So you not only now had your blood kin, but you had all of your in-laws as well, who would be bound in a kind of loyalty with you. But then in addition to that, there would be those to whom you gave gifts, or from whom you received gifts. So these are very, very important functions. Again, think of very specific things in Beowulf that would illustrate this. Do I see your finger on a button there? Or no, you're just, okay. Okay. Okay, any questions? I mean, feel free to interrupt me, by the way. This doesn't have to be a monologue. And I want to make sure that you understand what the questions are asking and what I'm expecting you to do with the questions. Yeah, question. Okay.
You said that you were going to reduce these questions. About how many questions are going to be on the test?
Well, I'll know when I get home and sit down at my computer and start thinking about it. Well, I'm sort of kidding, but I'm going to have to make this a reasonable number for you to be able to handle in a 2-hour period. So I actually kind of work backwards. You know, I think about how much time you have to write, and then I work out the number of questions from that.
Well, that's why I was asking the question, because in thinking about formulating my responses for the test, just to consider how much time that I'll need,
Right.
You know,
Right.
and how long that
Right.
I can make
Right.
each response.
Right. That's a very good question, or a couple of questions. And that's one reason why you're getting the questions ahead of time, so that you can actually be thinking about how you would respond to them. And you can go back and check your notes, or you can check in the text of the book itself. You know, oh, I can use this, or that's a good thing that, oh yeah, I remember, you know, we talked about that in class. You know, and, you know, look at this passage right here. Remember that that's what I did a lot of during our class meetings, is I was pointing you to specific passages. And those specific passages were to illustrate the kinds of things that I'm talking about, like gift giving, or Christian and so-called pagan, and so forth. Okay? Does that answer your question? And then what I usually do is I figure out, okay, this is a 2-hour exam, it's not a 3-hour exam. Some of our exams, as you know, here at the University of Houston, are 3-hour exams. Well, I figure, okay, how long does it take you to write an acceptable essay? 30 minutes? Okay, well then, if it's 30 minutes, then obviously I'm looking for a certain kind of essay. If I wanted you to write for a whole hour on something, right, I would be looking for a different kind of essay from you than if I only expect you to write for 30 minutes on something. So it also has to do with my expectations too. And I think that students have, in general, found my expectations to be reasonable. In fact, I've never had a complaint. You know, in all of the years that I have taught, I've never had a complaint about a test. Never had a complaint about a test, which is very interesting. You will find this reasonable. I mean, first of all, you're getting the questions ahead of time. Secondly, you're able to use your books. And then thirdly, you know, trust me, I'm not going to give you 15 questions to write on in that length of time where you'd only have a couple of minutes for each one, you know, and couldn't possibly give a good response in too short a period of time. Okay. Question number 4. Moving right along to Chaucer. Explain the dramatic principle in the Canterbury Tales and apply it to specific instances in the General Prologue in at least one of the tales. Now, you remember what the dramatic principle was? That there was a famous literary critic. Actually, it was kind of a younger contemporary, or an older contemporary of Tolkien's, named Kittredge. And he was a professor at Harvard for many years. And he developed this theory of what he called the dramatic principle in the Canterbury Tales. And Chaucer critics are still talking about the dramatic principle in the Canterbury Tales. They don't always agree with Kittredge's application of it, but nonetheless, his importance, like Tolkien's importance for Beowulf studies, is that Kittredge really set the terms for the discussion. So, the dramatic principle, first of all, that there is a connection between the person who tells a tale and the tale that that person tells. In other words, we meet each one of the tale tellers in the General Prologue. And then we have, not all of them because the Canterbury Tales was unfinished, but we have many of them telling tales. And those tales, according to the principle of the dramatic principle, would be further dramatizations, as it were, of the personalities of the tellers of those tales. Okay? But then the dramatic principle also means a second thing. And that second thing is that in the drama of the Canterbury pilgrimage in general, there is a dramatization of the relations among the pilgrims, not just each pilgrim taken by her or himself, but they have relationships among themselves. We've talked about how the miller and the reeve get into a dispute with one another. We've talked about how the wife of Bath seems to initiate a discussion not simply about marriage, but about who should have the upper hand in marriage, which initiates a whole debate in which the debaters are debating through the telling of tales. The form of the debate is the telling of tales. It's as if I told a tale and one of you didn't like the tale that I told or the point in my tale, and you told a tale against my tale, and then somebody else came along and told a tale against your tale, and so on and so on. In other words, people are interacting through the telling of tales. Okay, so there's a double dimension here to the dramatic principle. First, the connection between the teller and the tale that the teller tells, and then secondly, the relationship between the way in which one tale will relate to the telling of another tale. Okay? Is that all clear, what I've just been saying? And apply this to specific instances in the General Prologue and at least one of the tales. So what you can do is you can take somebody like the miller. We talked about the miller's tale, didn't we? And we talked about the miller in the General Prologue. We talked about the wife of Bath in the General Prologue. We talked about the wife of Bath's tale. Okay? If you know other tales, I mean, some of you may have studied Chaucer, elsewhere, and we talked about the other tales in the so-called marriage group, didn't we? So there are, once again, specific things to which you could refer. Okay, number 5. Describe Chaucer's depiction of social tensions as a principle of order or disorder in the General Prologue. And again, of course, be sure to be specific. Well, what on earth is meant by that? Chaucer is giving us a view of the society that was emerging in late 14th century England. We talked about that. We talked about some of the economic and social and political causes of the emerging of a new kind of middle-class culture. The beginnings of a kind of culture that eventually would come to be dominant over a long period of time. Now, notice that within this order, there's a good deal of disorder, isn't there? There are lots of tensions. There are petty jealousies. There are antagonisms. There are differences of opinion. There are biases. The host really doesn't like the partner. And there seems to be, a kind of sexual antagonism there. The clerk makes a slighting reference to the wife of Bath in his tale. Okay? We already know from the General Prologue that the wife of Bath gets totally out of sorts if anybody gets ahead of her going up to make their offering in church. During the part of the Mass, the ritual of the Mass, which was called the offertory, in which in the old days they didn't pass around a basket or something, but people actually would go in procession up to the front of the church and they would leave their offerings there. Well, she's always trying to elbow everybody else out of the way so she can be first. Okay, there are all kinds of social tensions going on here. So, we know even within the descriptions of particular people. Look at the description of the friar or of the prioress. So, consider that. Depiction of social tensions is a principle of order or disorder in the General Prologue. Is that clear? Okay. 6. Something that you can have a lot of fun with. Going back and thinking about. Discuss the wife of Bath's attitudes toward sex and marriage with reference to specific passages in her prologue and tale. Now that's something we talked a lot about, isn't it? And we looked at some very specific things in her prologue and then in her tale, and at some length. Remember, at the beginning of her prologue, what she's doing is she is taking on the authority of a lot of the most eminent scholars and even saintly scholars in the early and medieval Christian church. Many of whom, not all of whom by any means, had held up asceticism as the highest of Christian ideals, especially the renunciation of the things of the world, which would include not only nice clothes and great food and drink and so forth, but also sex, and who advocated living a life of holy virginity. And notice how she responds to that, with a very down-to-earth, common sense kind of argument. Because not everybody in the Middle Ages was an ascetic. Not everybody agreed with St. Jerome and his like. As I pointed out there, look at what the wife of Bath says. She says, holy virginity is a great thing for people who want to do that. That's wonderful. But she said, it's not for all of us, nor were all of us called to that even by St. Paul. And if everybody was a holy virgin, then where would the holy virgins come from? And then she goes on, basing her argument really on natural law, the whole philosophical position of natural law. Whatever God has created, just like in Pope, whatever God has created must be good. Milton, in a sense, says that too, doesn't he? Whatever God has created must be good. God couldn't create something evil. And if God has created us such that we procreate through having sexual relations, then sexual relations cannot be evil. In fact, they must be good. They must be intrinsically good. Okay? And so she says, and so I'm just going to go on enjoying it as much as I can. And while she's had 5 husbands, she says, welcome the 6th. She's ready and raring to go. And then she tells us about her first 3 husbands and how through various manipulations, usually through the use of sex and her sexual attractiveness, she's able to gain power over her older husbands, first 3. And then the difficulties she has with husbands number 4 and 5. And then we have her tale. Well, what's going on in her tale? Right? And what does her tale tell us about her attitudes, once again, towards sex and marriage? Which brings us back, really, to the dramatic principle. Because we look at the connection between her character as developed not only in the General Prologue, excuse me, but also elaborated on in her prologue to her tale, which is autobiographical, isn't it? And then, what's the connection of all of that to the kind of tale she tells? Okay? 7. Remember the Miller's Tale? One of the things that I talked about at considerable length is the plot construction in the Miller's Tale. We really don't have very much in the way of characterization, do we? We don't really know very much about Allison. She's really treated as a very two-dimensional character. She's a young wife. She's afraid of fooling around with Nicholas because she's afraid her husband might catch her. But as soon as he says, well, I'll work out a trick where he won't be able to catch us, she says, oh, well, okay, you know. I mean, there's no complexity of motivation here at all, is there? I mean, if we were going to have a different kind of story, we would have had, you know, going into her mind, finding out, well, I mean, does she undergo any kind of conflict here before she makes her decision, or even in making her decision? Well, we don't know. We know her only from the outside as a kind of two-dimensional character. Really, the same thing is true with John the husband, and also with Nicholas, and with Absalom, the would-be lover. They're really all two-dimensional figures, because the whole point of this story is not character analysis or psychological analysis. The whole point of this story is simply to tell a funny story through the manipulations of the plotting. Okay, just like most jokes. I mean, think about jokes that you have heard. Most jokes do not go into the motives of the characters in any depth, right? You simply have stereotypes. Okay? Well, any questions about that? We talked about the two different plots and how those two different plots are joined at the same moment, in the story, which is the culmination of the story. So the culmination of one plot is the same as the culmination of the other plot. Okay? Look back at that. You'll see what I'm talking about. 8. Analyze specific points of tension between courtly and Christian codes in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Remember Sir Gawain? He is pledged, of course, after he beheads the Green Knight, to go in a year to find the Green Knight and at the Green Chapel to submit to the Green Knight's acts. Well, He goes out in his quest, his nightly quest, but what happens? He ends up in this castle of Bersilac, Lady Bersilac, and this older woman who attends upon Lady Bersilac. And remember the kinds of things that happen there? Where you have the imperatives of courtliness and of courtly love coming into conflict with one another, right? As courtly lover, he certainly is given license to have an affair with Lady Bersilac, but in doing so, he would violate the code of the court and his hospitality, the hospitality which has been extended to him by his host, by sleeping with the host's wife, right? But also there's the conflict between the whole code of courtly love and the conventional code of Christian morality, right? Because the code of courtly love would sanction the sexual relationship even if the two lovers were not married and even if one or both of them were married to somebody else. But obviously that runs counter to conventional Christian morality. How are these things dealt with in the poem? And what kinds of tensions arise as a result of trying to deal with those conflicts in the poem, especially within Gawain himself. Especially within Gawain himself. Because Gawain, unlike the characters I was talking about a moment ago in a work like The Miller's Tale, is not simply a flat character, is he? We know a good deal about his thoughts, his feelings, his conflicts, his embarrassments even, such as when he returns to the court, to Arthur's court, and tells all, to his great embarrassment, but they accept him with laughter and even adopt his own green girdle as a sign of honor. Okay, we'll pick this up in our next segment.